Okay, I was asked last week by Lina and her team to give you a couple of things to think about if it's about the circular economy and finance. So if you can do the next slide, Lina. Um, so I've been doing research into the circular economy for about 8 years now. And I've been doing it for the European Commission and for cities. I wrote a strategy for the city of Amsterdam, for example, and also for companies that want to have technology advice or some strategy decisions of how to work with all these new paradigms. Because a circular economy is way more than just using secondary resources. That's the first step, and it's a very important step. But the other steps in a circular economy, for example, renting out equipment or leasing or sharing equipment, changes to the financial system, because the way we do it now, it's not geared up to do that. So what I want to cover with you today, I hope you can still hear me because it says my connection is unstable, but so tax plays a very important role, and I want to discuss with you a couple of things about what tax measures there are and how they play a role. Financing assets and risks. So this has to do with the shift away from ownership towards using goods. That means that, well, if you don't own them anymore, then it's somebody else's property. And how do you arrange for the risks if it gets broken down or stolen, or if there's a fire? But also on whose balance sheet are these items and how do you finance them? And lastly, about secondary markets and subsidies, because there are a couple of examples of how well, policy decisions and financial decisions about using secondary materials have unexpected side effects that we have to be aware of. So, okay, thank you, Lina, for the next slide. So, the basics of financial incentives is to change the rules of the game, right? So now we have, well, with the circular economy, or with the standard economy, so to say, you see that most companies try to externalize their costs, right? So if you have pollution, well, pollution is a burden on the environment, but the environment doesn't ask any money back for being polluted. So that means that that's free. Dumping waste elsewhere is cheaper than neatly organizing your waste flows. So if you look throughout all the options that we have in a circular economy, usually you will see that the worst options are the cheapest. So dumping your waste, just buying new cheap stuff instead of repairing. And the best options are the most effort. So for example, a best option is using quality materials, using quality design, but also internalizing your own waste stream. So making the most of, well, avoiding pollution, so to say. So you can, there are a couple of measures that you can do. Just one slide back, Lina, thank you. So if you see the chain of a product's life cycle, well, what you could be doing is have a tax on raw materials. So on the left-hand side, you see from raw materials, you have production towards retail. So if you want to shift to a cleaner economy, you should be taxing using new resources instead of taxing activities like repair. So in the middle box, you'll see that reuse and repair, and I will get to that later on in more detail, is that if you start repairing products, there are a couple of taxes at play. It's the value added tax for the service of repair, but it's also the tax on labor. For example, in the Netherlands, the taxes on wages, the tax on income is about at least 32%. So that means whenever somebody is working on your product and spends hours on that, that's very expensive, and usually more expensive than just buying a new product. And these incentives are really strong. And Yeah, so the last item on the right-hand side, you see there's the waste management hierarchy. And we'll get to that in more detail later on. But what you should do to change the rules of the game is making dumping waste and using landfills, for example, make that the least attractive economically, and making sure that repairing or keeping items in use for as long as possible make that the most attractive. And the only thing a state can do, well, in the financial sense, is either subsidizing, but that can become very costly, or or shifting the tax burden from, currently, I don't know the exact situation in Lithuania with the tax burdens, but usually you see that, yeah, the worst options environmentally, they are cheap by themselves, right? Just throwing the trash into a landfill is technically and organizationally a very low cost solution. Whereas repairing or separating trash is from itself is rather expensive because there are people involved and there's technology involved. So what you should do is rearrange the balance of those costs, and you can do that by working with taxes, or changing the rates of these taxes, because usually a landfill is operated by some form of government, be it a city or a county or the country itself. So you can adjust the rates basically. So that's the basic idea. Make the worst options more expensive than the best options. So Lina, if you can do the next slide, thank you. So a couple of common financial incentives I think would be good to know about because they play a key role in the circular economy is to rethink the value added tax and how it plays a role in the circular economy. And that's a thing that you can't do as a single member state. So the member states, they determine the value added tax, the rate of it. For example, in the Netherlands, it's 21% for luxury goods, luxury, and 9% for basic goods. And there are slight differences within countries, but the EU is working towards harmonizing these rates across the union. So if you want to do something with the value added tax, you can't do it alone. So that means that the European Commission is aware of this discussion and of how value added tax plays a role in the circular economy. But it means that you have to organize not as a single country, but as many countries, for example, in a region, to say, okay, we think that value added tax may be an issue. Means you have to collaborate with other countries. And the target of the value added tax, just one slide back, Lina, thank you, is consumers and slightly producers, right? So who pays the value added tax? That's the end user of a product. Now, another thing that is really interesting and works really well, at least in the Netherlands, but also I have examples of many other countries, is the extended producer responsibility. And the interesting thing about that is that it is very specific to the item itself. And I think you have some experience or read about it in Lithuania, that there is it's what do you call it? It's a deposit basically that you pay on bottles and cans to make sure.
Deposit system.
Yeah, basically it's a deposit system, and it makes sure. Well, it's a sort of a deposit system. So it plays in two ways. A standard deposit system makes sure that you as a consumer, if you buy a can, okay, you pay a little bit extra and you get that money back when you give the can or the bottle back to the store again. But the extended producer responsibility works a bit differently. It means that for every product that you buy, it may be a can or a bottle, but also a stereo equipment or a computer or a television. And for example, for television, it would be say 5 or 10 euros extra that you pay on top of the product. And with that money, the sales organizations, so you have to set up some kind of an organization that collects all that money from all the television sets being sold. And with that money, they organize a system to collect televisions once they are give
Yes,
them back by the
we have extended producer responsibility
Yep.
schemes in Lithuania for many products, and we have
Good.
Green Dot and all other type of organizations. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. No need to elaborate. Thank you. And then another one is the pay as you throw scheme. So that means that if you make waste as a citizen, you pay per garbage bag. And of course, there's always a fixed amount of waste that you have as a citizen, but usually you use the pay as you throw schemes to make sure that people separate the trash really well. So that means you apply the volume based or the pay as you throw scheme only on the rest waste streams, and on items like paper and glass and cans, you don't apply this levy, the pay as you throw. So it means it's free when you separate your tax, and only if you throw it all in one bag, it becomes more expensive. Do you have experience with this kinds of schemes?
Yes, we have them introduced in some of the municipalities.
Yeah, so that's a couple of common incentives. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, so the
one by one, or used?
It's good like this. Yeah, just show the whole slide. That's fine.
Okay.
So the VAT has a very strong price influence. In the Netherlands, it's about 21%. And the interesting thing is, if you look at the cycle that's shown on the right-hand side of the slide, you see a couple of things. So you purchase the item as a consumer, it's on the top. Then it has a useful lifetime. And the classical way is, well, you dispose of the product and well, you buy a new one if you want. So, and if you buy a new product, you just start at the top again. So you have you purchase an item, you pay the VAT, and you throw it away. But for example, if you're using a repair service, so suppose you have a really good product that can be repaired, say 10 or 20 times. So then the cycle goes from, well, purchase through useful lifetime, and then it goes through a repair, well, process. And the repair person has to charge you a fee, of course, to repair the product, and he also has to pay the value added tax. But the question is, if you repair a product, do you add value or do you retain value? And if you retain value, should you really tax that? So that's a shift in thinking that's, I think, pretty important, because if you repair a product about 10 times or 100 times, then each time you have to pay the VAT, which in the end can become more expensive than the product itself. So that's something I think we shouldn't allow happening. You want products to cycle as long as possible, and only once you dispose of them or when you buy new products, then the tax should come into play. So another way for the same scheme is, for example, if you follow the cycle from purchase, you have a useful lifetime, and you bring it to a second-hand shop again for reuse. So you go through the center. Then again, each time that you follow this cycle, you have to pay the value-added tax. So this is something to think about. It's a value-added tax. So if the product is if the value is retained, do you want to introduce the tax again? So this plays a big role in the first. So the pay as you throw, I think you have some experience already with it, but a couple of good qualities that it has is you can use it to increase the separation of waste. So you make the rest bin, you make that pretty expensive, and you make sure that separated bins for glass and paper and other items are free. And so You increase also the quality of recyclable streams, so only the nasty, wet kitchen waste, for example, goes into the kitchen bin, and only the rest waste is, for example, plastic. So you don't have to separate it again. And with the extra income, you can also finance a part of setting up the separate collection. So the variants are volume-based. So you have special garbage bags with a seal from the municipality, or you can have weight-based taxation. So you have to really weigh the waste that you collect. It's a bit better, but it's also more expensive to set up because you need special trucks. And people also have some privacy concerns about, well, what happens if the government knows exactly how much I throw away each week? It's a concern, so you need to address that.
Yeah, in Lithuania, Ministry of Environment regulates those payments and recommendations for municipalities. So yeah, we have a lot of feasibility studies for Lithuania, so I can share with the participants.
Good. Yeah. Okay. And so another key topic for a circular economy is about taxes on labor or wage taxes versus consumption taxes. So we are already familiar with consumption taxes, and in the Netherlands, they are about 9 to 21%. And the thing is, if you see directly in this slide, or in the right-hand side, you see a consumption tax being the VAT is 9 to 21%, and a tax level for labor is at least 30 to as much as 50% for people to work on items. But if you want to reduce the levels of consumption and increase activities like repair, then it makes sense to shift the tax burden from from labor towards consumption. And it has two effects. So it means that on the one hand, it becomes less attractive to consume, but it also has an employment effect because it makes labor cheaper. It makes it cheaper for people to repair things. And well, in basic economic theory, people assume that if something becomes cheaper, like labor, then you have more people at work on these activities that you desire. So this is a fundamental point for the circular economy, and the European Commission is aware of this, but it's hard to have nations change their tax system. So it's, there's talk about it, but there's
we have heard about that
action.
in Walter presentation, so it was a key message. Yeah.
Yeah, good. Okay, then another item on financing assets and risks, and perhaps this is a bit less known because the first items I talked about were about consumptions and labor. But if you want to reduce ownerships, so it doesn't make sense, for example, well, for some people, it doesn't make sense to own a car that you only drive for 2% of the time and the other 98% of the time it sits still. So that means that you don't need to own it. You just want to be able to use it whenever you can. Same holds, for example, for laundry machines. If you're living in a one-person household, why would you own the machine? Maybe it's easier to just use it and rent it, for example, pay per time that you wash. Well, this also holds for businesses, right? So should you really own a car as a business, or should you own the delivery van, or should you rent it? But it also goes a bit further. If you, for example, make a building and you want to be sure that you can recycle items within buildings and building materials, I think you all know the case of Philips and their lighting, that the business model is not to sell lamps, but to sell light. So Philips, or well, the company that operates the business model, they own the lights, and you as a building owner or building occupant, you pay the company for the light that you receive, but you don't own the lights. But it means that somebody else's property is in your building. So you need to have insurance arrangements, and also questions, for example, if it's about larger items in the building, And suppose you don't own the staircase anymore because the staircase can be recycled after 20 or 30 years. Then how do you put that in your balance sheet? Because you may be the owner of the building, but not all parts of the building. So you have to take account of that. I also saw a message, Lina, that I have 2 or 3 minutes until the discussion.
Yeah. Okay, let's move to the last topic and let's have at least some discussion.
Yeah. Okay. And another final item, I think, is governments are really keen to turn on those knobs. What can you do to stimulate the waste hierarchy or the circular economy? So I think one item, and I also heard in the interview last week for Lithuania, is for waste incineration. So we have this experience in the Netherlands with waste incineration plants. In the late 1990s, about 4 or 5 installations were built in the Netherlands, which were enough to handle all the trash in the Netherlands. But if you see in the waste hierarchy, incineration is the next to worst option. It's just a bit better than disposal, but that's it. But if you have overcapacity, that makes it really cheap. But also the installations have a long lifetime, say at least 30 years or so. And in the meantime, policy progressed towards more separation of waste and towards reduction of volume. So what happened is that these waste to energy plants, they had too little fuel, so to say. So they had not enough trash to incinerate anymore. So now, as the Netherlands, we are importing waste from countries like sometimes Germany, sometimes Italy, Naples, for example, and also the United Kingdom. So we are importing others' trash to burn in our country, which is, well, it's questionable. So I think that's a pressing example. And if you finance a part of the value chain, the second example is, for example, with the extended producer responsibility. So you say to the bottle producers, you are responsible for collecting the bottles and making sure that they are washed and shredded to pieces and sorted. Yeah, and then what? Because that's all what the system is for, just up to that part, but they're not responsible for making sure that that material is also used or is going somewhere. So you end up with huge piles of shredded and washed plastic that nobody wants to buy because, well, either it's more expensive or it's less pure. So make sure that the secondary material you want to stimulate, that there's also a market for it. So think of the whole chain and not only a couple of parts. So these are the key points, I think. So think about value-added tax rates, about shaping the tax from labor to consumption, and think about how you want to charge the finance, basically the waste system. And other discussion points, of course, but I don't know if it's for discussion. But at least you think about it.
Yeah. Thank you. So maybe we have some reflections from the audience. Or should I speak in, maybe, who doesn't speak English? Do we have such in the room? Then let's decide the language. Okay, ar yra klausimų auditorijoje? Jūs tai pirmiausia iš to, ką jis paminėjo. Jūs, do you have a translation? If I speak Lithuanian, do you have translation?
No.
So can you press the button of translation?
Let's see. Is it? Oh yeah.
Can you move to Lithuanian language and then?
I'm hearing you. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I can.
Okay, do you have translation? Because I want to move to Lithuanian language and then facilitate in Lithuanian language. So then, do you have translation?
Yeah.
Okay. Ar būtų auditorijai klausimų jūs, Ilona?
Okay, so in English or in Lithuanian?
Lietuviškai gal.
Lietuviškai, gerai. Aš susidomėjau idėją, kad taisymas daiktų turėtų būti pigesnis ir todėl skatinti nepirkti naujų daiktų, ar ne? Ir aš, kadangi pati dirbu su būtent tekstilės, odos ir, tai sakykime, tekstilės ir odos perdirbimo tokį projektą turiu. Tai vat aš galvoju, kaip tai padaryti, nes vis dėlto pas mus įvežamų, pavyzdžiui, drabužių sintetinių kainos yra tokios, kad žmogaus darbo net valanda nėra verta. Ir tai yra ta paskata sukurti kažkaip vis dėlto, aš įsivaizduoju, pati būdama ekonomistė yra labai sunku, nes kai pasiūla yra, tarkim, naują drabužį sintetinį nusipirkti, kainuoja ten per akcijas kokie 5 eurai, o sutaisyti drabužį arba jį persiūti kainuoja, tai yra jau žmogaus darbas, ten jau kiti įkainiai. Todėl aš galvoju, kaip šitoje vietoje galima sukurti paskatą nepirkti naujų, tarkim, drabužių, o persiūti, taisyti, perdaryti kitus daiktus iš tekstilės, nebūtinai tą patį taisyti.
Ačiū, Ilona. Justai, can you answer? You hear two voices in your head. Yeah, to translate.
Yeah. So what I understood is that you said that you found it a very interesting proposition for especially the clothing sector of how to use repairing to reduce repairing taxes for the clothing industry. But I didn't get your question onto it.
Ilona, galit patikslinti klausimą? Kaip jūs klausimą?
Yes, I'm interested in idea how to make that two prices of work of repairing, for example, and because it's a big difference. New clothes cost it very cheap, and to repair it's already work of some person. Yeah. So how to make the repairing is more attractive for customer than to buy new thing.
Okay, how it's in your country used for textile?
Yeah, so for textile is just as with bike repairs, for example, then at least the service of repairing falls in the 9% value added tax. So that's a bit nicer, but still there's the value added tax. And for the labor tax, it's just the same. So we don't have any labor tax differentiation for example, repairing instead of selling items. So that's a problem in the Netherlands too.
Okay, ar turite klausimų kiti iš to, kas buvo pasakyta? So and we are preparing not circular economy roadmap, but industrial roadmap. So hearing about these financial incentives and everything, so what we can have in our roadmap related with the industries? Because they expect to have, end of pipe solutions within this roadmap. And their questions are, can we have some money in the roadmap to cover our wastewater treatment installations or on end of pipe solutions? So everything what you have said are related with macroeconomy and related with use and not production. And here we have industry roadmap. Yeah. So what are your suggestions as a circular economy recommendations,
Let's see. It's that's not an easy question. It's because many of the examples I mentioned are focused on the end consumer, right? To make sure that the end product is better. So what you can do in industry, for example, I think business models for it's a good question. I don't have a very
okay, other countries, concrete. What they do, circularity models, or what they finance within industry, shift from products to services, or what kind of means you know from other countries?
Yeah. So for industries themselves in the production process, yes, you can have, for example, subsidies for cleaner production, or you can have loans. What's happening? So especially if it concerns energy costs, for example, then of course you have subsidies to make sure that the extra investment you make for energy efficiency is covered by the subsidy, or by a loan that you can pay it back by the energy bill. But I'm not really aware of incentives as the one I spoke about for industries themselves, because it's usually about capital equipment, about producing, about machines to produce items. And luckily, they are usually the best machines that you have, right? If you compare a consumer product, which is designed to break down after 3 years, with a manufacturing machine in a factory that is designed to last as long as it can, because you depend on it for your income. So it's a different niche also. So
yeah. And ką mano kiti apie pridėtinės vertės mokesčio galimas korekcijas Lietuvoje, kai vos maistui ekologiniam ten švariam maistui mes neturim pokyčių arba sunkiai praeina. Kokią manymą ekonomistų turime kambaryje? Gal žinote makroekonominiam lygiai diskusijas apie pridėtinės vertės mokestį? Gal kas komentuot galit?
Aš galiu pakomentuoti tik tiek, kad pridėtinės vertės mokestis yra lengviausiai surenkamas ir pats lankščiausias mokestis. Tai per jį mes galime iš tikrųjų labai daug ką padaryti. Tai yra pats lankščiausias mokestis. Bet
Lietuvoje jis yra pats sunkiausiai pajudinamas turbūt.
Taip atrodo, taip žinokit atrodo, bet iš tikrųjų ekonominės taisyklės veikia ir Lietuvoje. Viskas tvarko, nors ir mes labai prieštaraujam. Lietuvoje yra labai didelė blogybė, kad būtent darbo mokesčiai yra labai labai dideli ir neproporcingi. Tai čia reikia tą dalyką spręsti, nes tuoj bus išvis neapsimoka samdyti žmonės ir tą vadinamą sodrą mokėti ir taip toliau. Visi dabar pereina į tuos freelancerius, reiškia, ta prasme, labai labai dideli mokesčiai, tiesiog iš vis nemotyvuoja. O PVM-as, tai žinokit, yra tikrai lengvai realizuojamas dalykas. Per PVM-os slenksčius galima labai stipriai pakeisti vartojimą, tikrai.
Alvija, mes turime Alviją. O Juozai, kas laiką žiūri? Jau mes turbūt čia liksim, turbūt kiti.
Time is already up, so
okay,
yeah.
Alvija, your last point.
My last point about food consumption and thinking, from this perspective and thinking Lithuania as the basis for that, would you suggest also, increase taxation or VAT for those products who brings a lot of, CO2 and the highest pollution levels? So what is there also example in Netherlands and what we can do in Lithuania?
Yeah. So in the Netherlands, we are, everybody in the European Union is under the emissions trading system for CO2, right? And that's I think that's about the only macroeconomic scale solution that we have for emissions. And in principle, it works well as long as you make it expensive enough to emit. But that's a whole international debate, right? But other measures we don't have yet. We are experimenting with
no specific measures for Netherlands established yet.
No. Who can make a short presentation, 2-3 minutes to the audience? Maybe you can have the second slide of all instruments in one, and you can just summarize what was said in our room, okay? Can you still be with us for the next 15 minutes?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so kodėl mūsų negrąžina nieks į kambarius?
Reikia leave padaryti tikriausiai. Ar ne? Nėra?
Todėl, kad mes esame pagrindinėme kambary.
Už 50 sekundžių. Už 50 sekundžių visi grįžta.
Visi grįžta. Ačiū labai grupiai.